Yay, I think we're live. Hello, welcome, welcome. This is Christine Renee, and I'm joined with Shantel, um, who is our Reiki Cafe University apprentice, and she's finishing up with us. I'm really excited. And today we are going to have a coffee conversation. Instead of coffee, I'm definitely drinking some tea.
And I have water.
And I'm going to enjoy that. And we're going to be focusing this coffee conversation on Reiki and the grieving process. So I hope you guys enjoyed last week's coffee conversation on the death and dying process. And now we're going to look at really the post, like what happens after a loss and how can Reiki support that process. And I'm really excited that Shantel is on with us because this is something very near and dear to her heart. She has been through a tremendous amount of grief. And so I wanted to bring Shantel on for her to share her inspiring story, as well as kind of kicking us off on this conversation. So thank you so much, Shantel, for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Grief. First, I want to say that I know grief is a very difficult subject for a lot of people. So we're very aware of that. But I'm hoping by the end of this conversation, there's at least going to be a light at the end of the tunnel for our listeners to know that there's a way of moving through grief and coming back and knowing yourself and coming back into your own self-empowerment. So I don't know. Okay. I'm just going to start.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like know that if what we say doesn't resonate with you, if your truth is different, that is absolutely okay. I just want to remind everyone. And actually, before we get started, I have one more button I'm supposed to press. So know that with this coffee conversation on grief, like if it doesn't resonate with you, if you have a different truth, honor your truth, and that is okay. So everything at Reiki Cafe that we put forward, definitely feel into it, lean into it, be open-minded about it. And if it doesn't resonate, that is okay to set it aside and go, that's just not for me. And that's okay. Know that I also just, it was like a week and a half ago, I was at a death and dying conference and the main topic was on grieving. And so it was fascinating. We had the University of Arizona professor who's doing neurobiological studies on brain processes, doing MRI scans on people who are grieving and is writing books. And so it was really fascinating to have her come speak at this conference. And so I don't have a personal experience with grief, but I do hold space for others who are grieving as a Reiki practitioner. And I feel like as Reiki practitioners, because death is a part of life, because grief is a part of life, and grief doesn't only mean grieving from a loss of a loved one who has crossed over, it can be, grief can show up in a lot of different ways. And so we just want to let you as Reiki practitioners, as people who are interested in Reiki, know that Reiki practitioners are a great, wonderful source of care and support for the grieving process. And because it does work on the mind, body, and spirit, it goes to what it needs to go to. And we just want to highlight that this too is an option. Yeah,
for sure. So I was introduced, I don't even want to say introduced, but I experienced my first death when I was 4 years old. So my dad, he died in a motorcycle accident. And at 4, I recognized that life is very, it's fragile and it didn't feel safe. And so I grew up knowing that your people leave or can leave. And I didn't have this understanding of what grief was. I didn't know there was a process. I just knew that he wasn't there. And throughout life, it really created a lot of trauma and a lot of trying to recognize and understand who I was and what this whole thing of life was about. And then fast forward in life, I had 3 children, and my second son, he was born deaf. And from that, he became my biggest teacher in life. He taught me how to sign with ASL. He taught me about the deaf community, how to have a different view and perspective on being a mom. And then when he was 16, he was in an accident, and then he didn't survive that, and he transitioned very young, very early in life. And at that point was when my true awakening really hit. And that's when I really, like, face in the dirt, soul ripping, everything you can imagine, need to build myself back up kind of action. And when I looked around, I realized that because it was my son and I had my other children and my family, that I recognized that I also was, or I felt the responsibility to model to them what grieving was for me. And so I didn't want to become, I didn't want to lose who my son was in throughout my grief. And I didn't want to become another traumatic experience in my family's life, because I didn't know how to move through it. And so I was very conscious in my grieving process. I was very aware. I cried, I fell apart, I stood back up, I did it all. I celebrated him every month, every day. I had balloons for him every year, and we're going on 10 years in August. And so it's been a long journey and a long process. But through that, I've also learned a lot about people and life and the journey of grief. And with that, I've also learned how to move through my own, going from, like I said, from being like ripped apart to actually coming back and finding myself, which was really, really empowering.
So it can be a very much I mean, you're fully surrendering to the emotional process.
Yeah.
Right. And so when was it for you that you had kind of a shining light through the dark? Like, what was that experience like for you? Like, when did you know that you were going to turn a corner and not just be in the depths of it?
Well, there was actually a few points that I really recognized it. The first one was right after, within a couple weeks, I was in search of any answers. And so I did go to a medium, and I did have a reading done, and my son came, and it was powerful. And so I asked questions, and one of the questions that introduced me to soul families, soul contracts, and agreements was that we were kind of, I had left him, I had died in a past life, and he wasn't coming into this lifetime. He was actually coming for my soul's journey, for my expansion in this lifetime now. And that really hit me, like, wow, okay. So that took me to a much broader awareness of life, death, the cycle of everything. But I was still in the beginning of my grief. So I went through that for several years, and probably it was my 5th year where I recognized with my daughter that it was time for us to be able to move forward so that we can enjoy life again, you know, to really be able to not cry every time his name was said, or cry when I watched a video or a picture, right? I wanted to be able to enjoy who he was and his personality and all the things. And so about 5 years that started. And then at the 7th year mark, I received a message, you know, telling me that I went through each chakra. It took me 1 year per chakra to go from the bottom to the top of awareness and understanding. And that was a huge moment. I was getting ready to take a shower, and that came, and I hopped out like, oh my gosh, like I understood. And I knew on a different level why life happens, for at least in my experience, why it was happening the way it was. And from that point, now we're talking almost 3 years, I found Reiki Cafe, and Reiki came into my life, and it really just became, I became more present with it, and more conscious and aware. And Reiki is such a soft way to grieve and process that it really like brought me forward in it, and where I could connect with him spiritually. I can feel his energy around me, but where I can come to peace with it. And that was huge.
So I just want to go back to that, because I think that's really a beautiful aha moment, is that, so how far out were you in the grieving process? A year, 2 months from when you got like, let's move through the chakras with our grief? When did that happen for you?
I'm going to say that was probably, I didn't know I was actually going through it until my 7th year. And it was my 7th year when it hit me that what I have been processing.
Yes.
And then I was able to look back and go, wow, yes, I did.
Got it. So it's like an afterthought, like, look, you've made it through the 7 years and you worked your way through the 7 chakras and healed them. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it was probably 2 years ago now is when I really realized that, okay, so we have the process of grief, you know, and denial and acceptance and bargaining and all of that. But then when I started looking at it through the lens of our chakras, I realized, like, at first, you know, we are hit, like our nervous system is hit, our system has a complete shock. And so everything just like kind of falls apart, right? And then I started realizing that it's like your heart gets hit first, you know, we just shattered in our heart chakra, our throat, because then we have to speak a different truth. We have to explain to people what happened and how so-and-so died or how we're doing and all of the things. And then it goes down into your foundation with your root, and how are you going to pick up and live, and how are you going to move forward. And then our sacral is, especially as a mom, it's the mother's womb, and now my child's not here, and all of my future plans with him is no longer here. So I had to rebuild the idea of being a mom through my sacral. And then it goes in, then for me it went into my third eye, where I started to finally have a higher point of view, a bigger perspective, more awareness of his energy around me. And then my crown chakra, where I was really able to take that big bird's eye view, that big view of seeing the big picture and the why and understanding. And then finally into my solar plexus, where I was able to honor my son's soul journey as well as honor my own. And that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. I think that's just so beautiful. So knowing that you're in solar plexus healing right now through the grieving process, really like re-identifying, when did you recognize that like Reiki entered the picture? Like what chakra was that? Do you remember or recall it?
I would say with that one was fairly early on. I think when I was working maybe on my sacral is when I started to really recognize that my heart was already starting to heal. I was able to speak my truth a little differently with more, I don't want to say more power, but I was able, my story changed.
Yeah.
You know, and so our words are so important. And it wasn't like, oh, my son died. It became more of, I was able to sit with it for a moment before I responded. And then there became a moment where I watched a video of him and I laughed with him in the video. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I took a moment and celebrated that. Like I just watched him and I just dove into his personality and the essence of who he was. And I didn't have to cry. I was able to be joyful with him. And that was really, that was like that was a big moment for me. Cause
yeah, that big aha that you're on the other side of it. Yeah.
And I mean, I cry for him still. I always will. If I could trade everything for him, I absolutely would. But I know too that it's a disservice to us that our society doesn't communicate about grief and the process of it, and doesn't empower us to move forward with it. And I know people that have been in the same situation as myself, and they're still grieving like it happened yesterday, and they're in their 25th year or whatever, and that's a hard one, because I feel like that what that does is it tethers the soul to us in a way that where they need to be in their own action as well.
Yeah, for sure. And so at this conference I was just at on grief, Dr. Frances O'Connor, she really highlighted that there's 3 different types of grieving. And so you have your resilient grief. This is where after like you're still experiencing grief. Like, I don't think the grief goes away, but it slowly diminishes over time. And then you have like an acute recovery grief, where it's like your grief symptoms per se are reduced very quickly over time. And then you have the chronic grief. And so 25% of people experience the chronic grief, which is like this prolonged grief disorder. That's what you're talking about. Like this 25 years later, they're not moving through it. And one of my biggest takeaways from going to this conference was on when you have someone who you're working with through the grief, it's about bringing them to the learnings. And when you can ask them these what-based questions to help them move through it, so that, like, so for example, instead of asking, well, how are you? Go, what have you learned from the last time we've spoken? What's new for you? And just recognizing those little opportunities to collect like new information, like it's not just how are you, it's like, what have you learned? What's shifted? And I just thought that was so fascinating. Like, because of what you're describing, as you move through the chakras, when you could see it through that lens, you were like collecting information. You were collecting the learnings of the process along the way, and you were in a growth mindset instead of just being kind of in the blanket of it and not allowing to come out of it. So how does that resonate? How does that feel for you?
It does, especially the growth mindset. And I think with that one, it's not that, even though like I said, I consciously grieved in a certain way, but it wasn't because I was like, I'm going to be all strong. And, it was, but to have a growth mindset in the process of it is really important, I feel, because you're going to dip down, and you're going to have, you'll have your days of sadness and depression, and where you are going to just crawl into bed and your day's over. You're like, you know what? But when that moment is over, it's okay to get up and to get about your day again and go back to work and get into a routine. And so for me, I recognize, like, in the beginning of grief, grieve deep, grieve hard, do all of the things that you need to do, wear the clothes, crawl into the bed, whatever it is that brings comfort to the heart and brings a reconnection to yourself. But when that moment comes in and you start feeling yourself lifting a little bit, you start feeling that smile come back on, the laugh come back, give permission to do that, and I think that's really important to know, that we aren't doing anything to our loved ones because we're still living, and I think people feel like that. There's that guilt. There's the survivor's guilt of they're gone and I'm still living, and I shouldn't be smiling. I shouldn't be happy. And I take my boy with me with everything I do. I always think of him. When I see certain things, I'm like, hey, Austin, like, I talk to him, I communicate. And, because that keeps that action, that connection there. But I think that it also allows his energy still to be like, yeah, I got you, Mom, And so when that moment does show up, it is okay for us to give ourselves permission to be able to move forward and have a good time and enjoy life. Yeah. Because we're living for a reason ourselves, we still have a purpose here. And when he transitioned, I wasn't doing Reiki. You know, I had no idea what my future would be. And now here I have clients and I'm walking people through the grieving process myself and helping them through it. And yeah, who would have known if I would have just melted away, you know, what my life would be like right now. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's when I do have moments of grief, like I've been to a lot of funerals and a lot of people in my world have passed, not anyone's especially close. But one of the things that have always helped me was that connection to the other side, like being able to bring them here with me now, to be able to have those types of conversations or connections, or just knowingness that they're still around and present with me has helped so much. And I think that is a gift that spiritual seekers are open to, and that perhaps it supports us move through the grieving process because there's still that knowingness, that connection. And I do believe that, you know, as Dr. O'Connor was explaining, like, this is actually quite normal. It's quite normal to talk to your dead spouse or whoever you're grieving as if they're here now. Like, that's our brain is so wired to have the habits. It's like, and how she explained it was like, imagine that your living room, your dining room, your house setup is the same way all many years, and then all of a sudden you take away the dining room table, it's just poof, gone. This is the way your brain kind of recognizes, like, all of a sudden something's missing from your ordinary daily routines, and so you're grieving the absence of. And that's and it's really hard. But when we can get into the space of saying, you know what, it's okay for me to bring their presence here now. It's okay for me to call upon them. It's okay for me to say yes to having an experience with them, even though they're not in this physical realm with us anymore. I think that helps a lot with the grieving process, my own personal opinion.
Yeah, mine too. And I totally agree with that. I think that it really helps us. And I think that one of the things that I really learned too early on, especially when I had that reading, was in it, my dad also came through. So my grandmother, my grandfather, my dad, and my son all came through. And I had no expectation. I'd never had any experience like that. I just knew I needed answers for myself. And one of the things was I recognized that spirit is, you know, they vibrate at a different frequency than us, obviously. But if we're always vibrating at this low frequency of sadness and grief and everything, it's hard for people to connect. And I hear parents or family members that are like, I've never had an experience. Why is that? Well, because if we're always here, how can we bridge that gap between our realm and theirs, you know? So it's us lifting ourselves up. It's us resonating at a higher frequency so that we can have those experiences. And, you know, and when you have them, you know, you're having it. You know, people go, oh yeah, it's coincidental, or it's this. No, you know, because your heart tells you there's something within us. And as Reiki practitioners, when we're working with energy, we know energy, right? So you know something's happening, even though you don't see it, so it's like there's someone just spaced in, and they just came in my space, and oh, okay, I feel you. Am I communicating? No, not necessarily, but I know that things shift and things happen or whatever. And so I think that it's really important for people to understand that, so that we can lift ourselves up and we can have a fulfilled life even afterwards. But going back to saying again, you know, do take the time, because if you suppress it and you're just like, oh, I'm fine. Okay, that grief is going to come back. It will resurface.
Yeah, that avoidance, you know, the avoidance of doing whatever you can do to avoid the feelings, like that place. It then just becomes a tool to like stuff your emotions down, and then it eventually becomes a problem because you're avoiding the feelings, the thoughts, the behaviors, and it's just prolonging. Unfortunately. And you know what's interesting is from the brain science, is that the people who avoided the feelings and emotions actually thought about their past loved one more often because they had to filter all of their thoughts to make sure they weren't thinking about them. Rather than just feeling the emotions and letting it process, they were stuck in that avoidance area, and it tended to keep them in the grieving process longer.
Yeah. And then what does that do? I mean, as we know with our chakras, and it's like illness and disease can come in, anxiety, stress, all these other things start to, manifest within our body. And it's like, to me, going through the grieving process is, as hard as it is, I would rather that than at the end of it, I'm like, oh yeah, and I'm sick on top of it, and I'm got all this going on. And having a fear of death, which is huge, because you don't want to lose your loved ones. Nobody does, but it is part of our life. We just as a society here, we're very tight-lipped about it. We don't want to talk about it, and it's like, somebody goes and then they're buried, and the family members, everyone goes back to their life, but the one who's really grieving is still stuck in that. And then it's like forgotten. So for me, I like to honor those in my passed on loved ones. I do. And, but it's good. It's good to remember. And if somebody is talking, I always ask, well, what was their name? And that in itself is huge.
Huge.
What was their name?
Like, if we can just honor people's names instead of just, asking how the individual is, can we honor the name? Like, just asking what was their name, and can just make it feel so validating. And I think that's a huge part. Like, if we can, I think our culture is funny. Like, I think we live in a really weird culture around death and dying, and have medicalized it so much that it's a bit weird to me. And I think it's because I personally feel so comfortable with the conversation. Like, every time I see my parents, like, they know I'm going to be in charge of all of the things and taking care of them when they're old, and that's fine. Like, it's normal. Like, I'm totally okay with it. But like, every time I talk to them, like, have you guys decided what do you want to do with your bodies? Like, whatever. And I'm like, just to have, like, no big deal, very much part of the everyday conversation. I'm just totally okay with it. And I know that I'm the oddball. And so I just is so interesting compared to other cultures, whether you're looking at Latin culture, or you're looking at the Jewish community, or, like Eastern Europe, like, such different responses to death, or African cultures, right? Like, it's so much like, just pretend that nothing's happened and just go pretend that everything's okay.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not healthy.
It isn't healthy. It isn't healthy at all. I mean, when you figure you're like given traditionally like 5 days to grieve, to go get off of work. My daughter, like, even in the school system, so she took time off. She ended up going on home studies, which I personally believe, as soon as there is an immediate death, the kids should be automatically on home studies. Don't put the extra pressure on thinking the parents are going to show up and the children are going to show up, because they can't. And there was a moment when they're like, well, you kind of got to move through it. I'm like, okay, it's been 3 weeks. No, we're not there yet. And that attendance lady, she was lucky I didn't punch her, because I was like, get your stuff, kid, let's go. We're out of here.
Right. Totally. Absolutely. Like, it's the institutional system that says, be productive and you must do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise you're depressed. I'm like, wait, depression and grieving might on the surface look the same, but they are very, very different.
They're very different.
Very different. And, it's interesting how death has shaped our American culture as we've medicalized it over time. It was really common to be someone under 40 who'd attended a death before the age of 40. Like, that was normal 100 years ago. Of course, death is happening in the house and people are around. And now it's so medicalized. 20 years ago, only 20% of people were dying at home. And
Mm.
now that number has gone up to 84%. Now dying at home, it's like become more popular. So we're seeing the shift back away from medicalization now that we have more and more hospice options. And I'm curious if there's also going to be this shift, and with more and more people seeing death, that there's going to be more and more acceptance of grieving. So I'm kind of like hanging out, kind of like, we'll know more in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think we're also in a spiritual, shift in in the world as well, right?
Yeah.
We're all kind of shifting to this awareness of spirituality globally. And I think it's very curious to see how that's going to work with the death and dying and grieving communities.
Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't know the statistics of it, but it makes sense. And especially with the spiritual awareness and everything that is coming, people are a lot more open with it, I believe. At least I feel like that in my world and like my realm. And then I think what is so common knowledge now, and then I speak to somebody that it isn't, and I go, oh, okay, yeah, there's still that thought. Like, and for me, I don't resonate there anymore. So it's interesting. But yeah, I think people are coming around a lot more differently, and there are different options and everything. And so I think as people like just come to talks like this and have conversations like this and know there is a process and know there is a way to move through it, to where you can honor yourself, you honor your grieving process, you honor your loved one, and at the same time you're also honoring your loved living family, right? And then you can come back and be whole again. And so with people that, when they especially like hear my story and they're just like, and how are you functioning? And it's like, because at the end of the day, I do have loved ones that still need me. And so I don't want to be a burden. That was my thought process. I don't want to be a burden. And then that doesn't help anybody. So that was how I kind of moved through it. But at the same time, when people see that and feel it for themselves, I see it in them. And I'm like, yeah, it's beautiful. Instead of hearing about like the anger that's still there years and years later. And it's just like, wow, or people that keep the bedroom the same. When I went to grief counseling in the beginning, there were parents that still had their children's bedroom the same as it was. And I was like, wow. And I didn't realize that, because I didn't know anyone who really lost a child. And so I think that too was a big aha moment for me. Because when the time came, and I remember walking into my son's room at some point, and I was like, oh, like the Austenness was like fading, right? So then we actually shifted the room, and my daughter moved in, but we created a space for him. And that was a really good way of us to just keep that energy going. And I didn't get rid of his stuff. I kept his things, and I have them packed, and I have them in a space. So I don't feel like, because someone's gone, you have to get rid of everything either. I built memory boxes, and I have things around my home that you wouldn't know unless you know. So it's not like you walk in, you're like, oh, it's not like that. But it's definitely, he's around, and he's my son. So there might be a different thing with that. But I think there's so many ways of working through it and being creative. And, so there's just so many different ways. And
I think I really like that, there is a lot of different ways, and we don't have to necessarily do it the way everyone else does. Like, there's not a rule book of the way you're supposed to grieve. Like, even with the whole, like 5 stages of grief, and like, you don't have to necessarily go through all 5 stages. It might not look like one phase to the next phase to the next phase. That doesn't usually work for most people. And so when we can once again break out of the box of what systems have told us and say, what feels good for me today? How can I honor this person today and keep moving through it? So I love the idea of having like little mementos around the house that mean something to you, but maybe on the outside, no one will know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and we did, like, we release balloons every year, and we've done a lot of things that became very like ritual for us and honor. But I'm feeling there's a shift even now that's happening. I remember at the beginning, at the very first, the anniversary of his first year, I remember crying because I survived. I was like, oh my gosh, I survived. I made it through a year, because a year ago, looking a year ahead, there was no way I could see myself still living. And then I made it, and it was like, I remember sitting there at the counter going, I survived. So that gives those little milestones, we can celebrate, you know, like, give yourself that time and grace to do it, and to be like, celebrate those little moments of grief, I believe, because it is hard work. It really is. It's not an easy journey. And so when we're doing it, you know, we should give ourselves that moment.
Absolutely. Did you ever have Austin show up in your dreams? Like, have you noticed how it's affected your dream time?
You know what's crazy is, so I've always been very visual, and then when the moment it happened, my third eye shut completely. I stopped dreaming. I couldn't visualize a thing. I couldn't nothing for like 2 years. And then which is crazy, because now I am such a visual, like, I journey, I see when I'm on the table and I'm working on my clients and stuff. So it's weird to think back when I couldn't, but if you said visualize a red apple, I couldn't see nothing. And I know that was my body's way, like my nervous system's way of protecting me. But I do, I would get a lot of messages in my waking days that I knew was him. And then, so yeah, not so much in my dreams. I wish I asked for him to come, you know, I'm like, I want to see your face.
Yeah, I remember waking up the other night. Like, so I put my dog down like 3-4 weeks ago now, and I think I was going to sleep, and I just like, I just want to know that you're okay. Just like give me a sign or whatever. And then he showed, like, I saw him in a dream, and he had his 2 favorite blankets like over the top of him, and he was running around. He had this goofy grin on his face. I'm like, oh yeah, you're good. I love when, you know, sometimes we get signs like that, and sometimes we don't. Like, if you're not a visual person, and it might be a come and go thing. Like, if you're in it too thickly in the moment, give yourself grace. Give yourself a lot of grace, and knowing that, you know, as soon as you move through it, the chakras will begin to unlock, and those gifts will come back.
That's a really good point. And before I really knew chakras, I always put it like it's my brain's way of protecting. But that, like, yeah, they're unlocking, they're healing. And so as that's happening, you know, it reopens you to the energy that's outside of our norm. And yeah, that was a really good point.
Yeah.
See, there's an aha moment right there.
Right?
They unlocked.
They're all over the place. I think I mean, I just see so many people where the grief just it settles, you know, like it just there's a term, I think it's a Norse term, where it's grief is upon me. Right. So it's not like I am grieving or I'm in a state of grief. It's grief is upon me. And I love that separation, so it doesn't become our identity.
Yeah.
Right. And so when grief is upon me, you're just in it, like you're with it, but it's not who you are. Grief is just upon you. And I love that differentiation. When I heard it the first time, I've heard it a couple of times over the years, I was just like, that makes so much sense. But when people are identifying with it so fully, give up their identity to it, that they're the survivor, they're the whatever, it becomes too much of their personality, too much of their life. And when grief is upon you, you can take it off for a while and put it back on when you need it. And it's okay to kind of just be with it when it's time. Grief is upon you. Mhm.
I love that. I see it like grief is walking with me. Like that's kind of how I always felt like it's here. It's just almost like it's because I feel like grief can be very compassionate, if we allow ourselves to be cradled in that way, to go through it in that way. Um, but I do like that with it, how it's upon me, because it is where you can take it off and you put it back on, because there are going to be those moments where even 20, 30 years down the road, you're going to cry for that person, or whatever it is. And so it's okay. It's okay to feel it. It's not like you're relapsing or anything. And so, yeah,
Right.
that's a pretty cool way of putting it too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, is never going to fully gone. It's always
Mhm.
going to be there, and um, just to move through it. So I had a client once who didn't really recognize that she was still in the grieving process, but what she was coming to me for was a pneumonia. And so when I was doing the Reiki session, I was doing a shamanic journey as well. And I was able to talk to her mother who had passed. And the mother was like, she's got to let me go. She's got to let me go, move on. I'm not her spirit guide. Like, I love her, but it is time. And this was
Mhm.
probably at about a year, maybe a little longer. And clearly the spirit was like trying to move on, but the grief was holding her. And when I passed along the message, the client just was full of tears, really did a big release work, and then went to get x-rays the next day for the pneumonia, and the pneumonia had cleared completely. And
Wow.
so it was kind of like, this is what happens when we don't move it, when we just hold on to it so intently.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to move through the chakras. It needs to move and express. It needs to move out of the body. We need to cry. We need to, process this way. Like, there are certain tears that toxins only leave the body through tears of sadness. And there are certain toxins that only leave the body through tears of joy. And we
Yes.
remember this to go, it's okay to cry and it's okay to process, because when the chi gets so stuck in one spot, we start to develop these physical ailments. And so it was amazing to kind of just watch this, really, like, had an x-ray, did a Reiki session, had another x-ray, and it just be gone. And it's like, you needed to emotionally process, and you needed to give yourself permission to let go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that part really is giving yourself permission, and going back to what I was saying earlier, it is because if we don't give ourselves permission, we're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? Our brain, our nervous system is taking over. And it's like you can become just robotic in your everyday. And so it's really coming back and taking control of your life again, and recognizing that the sun's going to set and the sun's going to rise every day. And what are you going to do? So it's having that intention every day of being able to get up and having your goals set. And what is it? Even if you're just getting up to go have that cup of tea in the beginning, or just laying on the couch, but you move from the bed to the couch, and then you move from the bed. Now you're taking your showers, and now you're eating, because you stop eating. So now you got to go, start eating a little bit. So then you move up to, full plates again. And so it is all those little steps. But once you start to really be conscious and give yourself permission to eat, to digest, to be with your food, for example, there is food I couldn't eat for a long time because it was his favorite. Like I couldn't go to the store for months. I cried over hummus. I mean, it was like I cried over things, and I just knew I had to process it. I knew I had to do it. And I was okay. I'm sure I look like a hot ass mess out there crying over tank tops and coals, but I knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. But of course I held myself together, but there was just those moments of I couldn't, and I was just too full. I was just filled to the brim of tears and sadness and grief. And so now when I go, I can see things like, oh, he would have liked that. But who knows? I mean, he was 16. Now he'd be 17 or 27 in August. I mean, I don't even know what he would wear, you know? So
Right.
at this point, but I can only think of because of who he was. But it is, it's definitely a journey,
It
and
is.
not one I wish upon people, but it is a journey to move through, and especially if you have other children,
Mhm.
to recognize them too, and to honor their life, and knowing that they're going through the loss of a sibling, and if they lose us as a parent in the process,
Yeah.
then it's really important to pull that in
Yeah.
too, and recognize that.
And grief is so much a part of the human experience. We'll all lose a parent at some point. We'll all lose someone close to us.
Mhm.
And just to know that Reiki is there to soften it. Like you said earlier, I love that you said that. I had to write it down. Like Reiki is such a soft way to grieve because it
Mhm.
just holds space for wherever you're at. So having that Reiki level 1 to provide self-healing or to go get sessions from someone is a beautiful way to help support the grieving process. I truly believe that.
Yeah, I do too. I do too. Because even though I was, several years into it, when Reiki came into my life, um, and I was really able to sit with that intention, it was like, whoa, to feel the lift off the chest, and to feel the heart space clear open, and my heart chakra to start to expand again. It was like, what is that? It was like feeling all over again for the first time, like, oh my gosh, there's something happening, there's a shift. um and anger, I've ran with anger for a long time in my life, because growing up with death, and so it took me so many years in my life, like the majority of my life, to figure it out. And now I just don't resonate with that emotion anymore as like I did. Do I still get mad? Yeah, but is it like that spitfire, Sagittarius that I've always been like, I'm a fire sign and here I am? But really, what it was is I was a hurt child. I
Mhm.
was a grieving child, and I didn't know I was a grieving child until I went through the grief of my son and learned how to grieve. And, so teaching our children how to grieve is so important, because the children become the adults that hold that anger and the resentment and all the things. And, this is where the awareness comes from,
Yes. Yeah.
and
And
breaking cycles in our family.
letting it be a part of the family process. Like I do feel like we need to bring death and dying and the family all home. Just makes so much sense to me. Not that it can be done every time. Like I understand that accidents happen, hospitalizations happen, but when available, why not have the family nearby? Let the child see the death and dying process. Maybe not like the whole time, but know that
Mhm.
it's going on. Like I had my best friend's father died when I was 12, and I was definitely at his bedside during his last days, and made a big impact on me. And knowing that even though this is incredibly hard, that it's part of life.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there
My
anything
Oh,
else that's
go
like
ahead.
really coming up? Is there anything else that's really coming up for you that you want to illuminate for our listeners?
Um, I think just one, if you're going through the grieving process, like I said, just, give yourself that time, be patient with yourself. And if you're the practitioner that's working with clients, hold that space for them as well, and really see it through the lens of the chakras, and where are they, and what can you tap in? How can you help them through the process of empowerment and everything? And so, for me, seeing it that way, and knowing, like, I love that when you're saying that it's unlocking them. I see that right now. I'm like, yeah, it is. It's unlocking that energy, that stored up energy that gets stuck. And so doing the spinning or doing the whatever, it is going to be really powerful. So yeah.
And recognize if you are in the grieving process, if you're in that rumination phase of looping the thought processes and the what ifs, should haves, could haves, regrets, knowing that that is a sign that perhaps you should reach out for some support to help you break the loop, break the cycle of rumination, because we can't change the past. It's in the past. And if that, I feel like from what one of my other takeaways from this conference was, it's those that are in that rumination cycle that get stuck there that have a longer grieving process. And so we would love to help you or find a Reiki practitioner who has experience in the area of grief, to reach out for support, because helping recognize that those thoughts are keeping you stuck, and we need to bring ourselves to a place of learning, and that we can learn through the grief, that we can find the lessons of grief, and we can honor the persons or people who you're grieving. And rumination, it can just be like stuck in the mud. Yeah,
for sure. And for those who, understand or who believe about soul agreements and all that, for me, that was huge. When I really learned that opened up so much for me, because I was like, oh, it was his choice on a different level. Here in a human level, no, like on this side of the veil, we're not programmed and we're not made to lose our loved ones. But on that other side, there's a bigger picture to it. And I really think that there's a lot of power in knowing that. And, so for me, that really was a huge point.
Yeah. Agreed. That's that crown chakra point of view, like the big picture, soul agreements. Why are we here? Who's in our soul families? What lessons do we need to learn? All of that. Yeah. I feel kind of just can really help pull you out of that rumination process of the regrets. And so, Reiki is a fantastic tool to help support you, your loved ones through the grieving process. And we'd love to know your stories too here at Reiki Cafe. Know that we have a Facebook group. You can look up Reiki Cafe. It's just facebook.com/group/Reiki Cafe. And we would love to hear your stories. If you're watching this live stream on YouTube, please let us know in the chat what you're working through. If you need support, we'd love to connect, because it's all about community. Here at Reiki Cafe University, we want to support the Reiki community. And if you're in the grieving process, please do reach out for support. We did get a few questions in that I want to kind of look at, make sure I don't ignore. So know that about a week ago, so not this week's podcast, but the last week's podcast, and we do have it up on YouTube as well. We have a whole podcast on the death and dying process with Reiki. So if you're interested in understanding information on Reiki and hospice, or the death and dying process with Reiki, that is, go there. Like this particular conversation was really specific to the grieving process, but we do have a whole podcast and YouTube video up on the death and dying process. So be sure to check that out. And so Carrie says, my dad passed in February. I did a couple of Reiki sessions with him. I could see red, not sure what that means. Well, this is always curious. When we see things, we have to kind of pause and go, well, what does the color red mean to you? And what does the color red meant to your father, right? Is it a special connection between the bond between each of you? Or is it like, I'm not sure. And perhaps the red has to do with the root chakra, which is the color of root chakra. So you always want to pass those first few questions of clairvoyance through your own filter before you just do a Google search on it, right? We want to go, what does the red mean to me? And what did it mean to the loved one that I've lost? And see if you can make any connections there first, because most likely that's where the answers are. We definitely have a couple people in the chat who have lost people. Gabriella said that she had a dream 2 nights ago with your mom. It's beautiful. I love that. Yeah. And knowing that Reiki can open up your clairvoyant gifts. So if that helps with the dream space, absolutely. Absolutely. Mm. Yeah. So Gabriella says, I'm curious if those seeing clients ever had clients come for Reiki for grief. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure. Because I mean, especially for people who know about Reiki, they recognize that it is a supportive healing tool. And so I would love, like, if I could paint the picture, I would love to see Reiki being in every hospice, home
Oh
kit,
yeah. Yeah.
brochures and flyers. Like, I feel like Reiki belongs in all of the spaces and phases of life, including the death and dying process, and not just for the person who is passing, but for all of the family members, because they're emotionally processing, and Reiki helps emotionally process. So I'm a huge advocate for Reiki for all things, but I think, yeah, it absolutely makes sense to have clients come in for their grieving process. And oftentimes when that happens, we do connect with the loved one that's passed. That's happened numerous times for myself. And not to say that I'm a medium. I wouldn't call myself a medium. I shamanic journey. And if they show up and they have a message that they want to relay, I'm available for it. Right. So I do think that Reiki can support all those areas for sure.
Yeah. I've had several clients that they're like, my so-and-so showed up, and they're like, I've never seen them or felt that, and it's like, because that energy is so big that it's like, oh, they're able to come through, and it's like, it's really powerful for them. It's
Yeah.
like, and that guides them through the grief. Like, that's how Reiki really helps them.
Absolutely. Well, and it's
Yeah.
also very much like it helps go, they're safe, they're okay, they made it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've helped so many souls cross over that might not, like, they didn't know that they had passed. And that also, like, having a Reiki practitioner just to kind of check on that person's soul and be like, did they make it? Are they okay? Like, all of those things. Not that that happens very often, but like accidents, when it was unexpected, when there wasn't time for that person to process what was happening, and then they're all of a sudden dead. It's those types of things that it's nice to have a healer around. And thousands of years ago, it would have been, you had the shaman, you had the healer, you had the person in the village that was there to be supportive of that process. And so I feel like death and dying and grieving process all is surrounded in so much spiritual energy, and that we need to call that back. We need to bring that back and take as much of the medicalization of the process out.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. So we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to share your stories. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, feel free to share them with us. We love our Reiki Cafe community, and we're so grateful that you came on to watch, to listen, to share in the chat. Thank you so very much for being here. Know that we have got a couple of upcoming Reiki Cafe University events. I just want to share quickly. We have a workshop on Monday. If you are a Reiki practitioner and want to learn about how to guide your clients through a journey, through a process of from the first time they meet you to their sessions to the upsales, like business oriented call. If that's of interest, that will be on Monday night. So I'll put that in the show notes. Know that that is going to be on Monday night. We have that workshop coming up. We also have a vision board workshop coming up on the 24th. And we have Shantel is going to be doing our distance Reiki circle, not tomorrow, but the following Friday on the 21st in the Reiki Cafe community on our Facebook group. So we have another coffee conversation coming up next Wednesday. So we have a lot of events happening. So be sure to follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, join our Facebook group, because you're going to find all of the information there. So be sure to like, follow, and subscribe, all of the things, and know that so many of these live events end up on our podcast, Reiki Cafe Radio. we'd love for you to follow along there as well. Thank you everyone so much for being on tonight. So appreciate you taking the time out of your evenings to be with us, and just really looking forward to supporting you. That is why we are here and doing what we do. So thank you. Have a great time.